Our lecture for this week is going to briefly explore the history of early Greek philosophy to help us better understand the project of ethics. But before we get into the history, it might be helpful if I first give you a framework to help you understand the significance of what might initially seem like strange ideas. I'm convinced that the first Greek philosophers were interested in discovering the nature of a just society. And to make such a discovery, it involved them asking some deep ethical, epistemological, and ultimately metaphysical questions. Now, the basic ethical question that they were after is the question of whether or not the task of developing ethical principles is a task of discovery, which would imply that ethical principles are objective, or whether or not the task of developing ethical principles is a task of invention, meaning societies invent moral principles, they don't discover them. Those who argue for this latter position would be referred to as moral relativists. And so next week, we're going to dive more into that question of whether or not moral truths are objective or relative. But for now, I'll simply explain the framework for how many of the Greek philosophers sought to answer this question. And so first, the early Greeks argued that you cannot know whether moral truths are objective or relative until you have a handle on metaphysics. Metaphysics is the study of reality. What is really real? Are there moral facts that exist in the fabric of the universe? If so, what is the nature of those moral facts? The Greeks also argued that you need to know something about epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. How do we know the things that we say we know? How do we know right versus wrong? And then there is ethics, which is the study of the good life. What moral principles ought to govern our behaviors, both as individuals and as a society? The Greeks argued that only once we get a handle on these basic fundamental questions can we have the wisdom to understand how to approach any particular moral situation. The Greeks were convinced that great learning is required to discover what is meant by a just society. And so the history of this project began in a city called Miletus around the 6th century BCE, although philosophical thinking and writing most likely occurred before this as well. But as far as the available record of history is concerned, the first Western philosophers were called Milesian philosophers because they came from a city called Miletus. And what we can tell from the fragments of their writings is that they were concerned about big metaphysical questions of life, questions like how or why do things come into being? What is the basic substance of reality? Does everything reduce to one substance or to many substances? And of these Milesian philosophers, the first and most famous philosopher was a philosopher named Thales. Thales was a type of engineer by training, and he answered the question, what is the nature of reality, by explaining that all is water. In other words, the basic substance of reality can be reduced to water. Now, if we think about this, this might seem like a strange suggestion, but we might understand why he would make it. In some places where there's no water, things seem to die. The human body is composed mostly of water. Water comes down from the sky, and if you dig long enough, eventually you will find water in the earth. Or if you look out over the ocean, it seems as though water goes on forever. And so there are many reasons why we might understand Thales' suggestion that everything is water, or that the basic substance of reality is water. Shortly after Thales, the philosopher Anaximander argued for something different. He argued that all is apeiron, which is Greek and could be translated as some sort of indeterminate boundlessness or infinite boundlessness. Now, there are many ways to imagine what Anaximander is trying to say here, but I think it's helpful to think of it in contrast to Thales. If Thales argued that everything is reduced to water, then we might think of Thales as a materialist, with the most basic substance being water. Today we call this doctrine materialism, the belief that the natural world is, to use the words of Carl Sagan, all that is, all that was, and all that ever will be. Anaximander, in contrast, might be understood as arguing that a material substance cannot be the basis of all reality, since material substances are finite. And so let's do a thought experiment to help us understand what Anaximander might be saying. Imagine that the picture on your screen represents the entirety of the universe. From an early Greek perspective, we might want to highlight that the universe consists of earth, fire, water, and wind, or air. Now, in this thought experiment, you can imagine what it would be like to remove each of these elements. It is possible for water to not exist, which means that it cannot be the basis of reality. It's also possible for fire to not exist, or for air not to exist, which means they cannot be the basis of reality either. You can imagine the earth not existent. But if you delete all of these material substances, what do you have? Well, from our perspective, we might say that the universe is still there. But this too might be described as a material contingent reality. And so we could delete the universe as well. So once you've deleted all of these material substances, what do you have? Anaximander described this as the apeiron, an infinite, impersonal, non-material, non-spatial, ultimate reality. At this point, a distinction emerges that later philosophers will call the distinction between necessary objects, or facts, or beings, and contingent objects, facts, or beings. A necessary being, or a necessary object, such as the apeiron, exists by necessity, meaning that you cannot logically conceive of this not existing. Whereas contingent beings exist on the basis of something else. It is possible for this world to not exist, or for life to not exist, because we are contingent beings. We owe our existence to some other more fundamental reality. And so when we look at these first philosophers, Thales being a materialist, arguing that the basic substance of everything is water, and Anaximander being someone who argues that there is some sort of indeterminate ultimate reality outside of the material universe. Well, after Anaximander comes Anaximenes, and he was a disciple of Anaximander, and he argued for the idea that everything can be reduced to air. After these first three philosophers, you have a whole host of other ideas and other proposals for what might be considered the most basic substance of reality. So you have Pythagoras, who rejected materialism and argued that numbers is the basic unit of all reality. And we can think of this suggestion as being reasonable, since it seems like when you look at the order of the universe that we can measure it using mathematics, and so maybe reality itself is reduced to some sort of quantity. Then you have Parmenides, who argued more abstractly that everything is reduced to one substance, but he just called it some unchanging being. So everything is one according to Parmenides. There's no distinctions. Everything is one. Zeno then comes along and he agrees with Parmenides, and he defends Parmenides with his paradox of motion, which I won't get into here, but it's an argument, a reductio ad absurdum argument, demonstrating that Parmenides is right. After Zeno comes Heraclitus, and Heraclitus argues against both Parmenides and Zeno, arguing that everything is really in flux. He said everything can be reduced to what he calls a fiery logos. So fire is something that is constantly changing. So it's not static, it's not one, everything's constantly changing. And so Heraclitus saw reality that way, everything's always changing. And then logos is the Greek word for where we get the word today, or um, reason or logic. Everything is orderly. It's a changing orderliness of the universe. Empedocles argued for a form of pluralism, that everything can be reduced not to one basic substance, but to four. Everything can be reduced to water, earth, air, and fire. And then from there, you have the atomists who take pluralism to be a doctrine where everything is reduced to an infinite number of atoms, and each of these atoms are indestructible. Anaxagoras was an atomist, but also a dualist, where he argued that there is one all-controlling mind that brings unity to the infinite number of parts, or the infinite number of atoms. And so each of these philosophers, and you don't have to remember all the details here, but each of these philosophers are offering a different perspective on the nature of ultimate reality. Now, this caused some philosophers to eventually get frustrated with the whole project, and they gave up on it, or at least they thought they gave up on the project of metaphysics. These philosophers were called Sophists. And so the Sophists recognize that the great philosophers of the past could not agree on these foundational issues. They could not agree whether the foundation of reality was ultimately material or whether it was immaterial. And what made it worse, from the perspective of the Sophists, was that both sides usually presented compelling arguments for their respective positions, as well as compelling arguments against their opponents. And so the Sophists come along and they argued that the pursuit of truth, at least regarding these big questions of life, is a fruitless pursuit. We cannot know what is ultimately real. We do not have access to it. So we need to stop wasting our time on truth. And instead, we should start focusing on rhetoric and persuasion. And so one of these Sophist philosophers is a guy named Gorgias. Gorgias has an interesting argument to support this idea. Gorgias argues, first, that nothing exists. This is his foundational premise. And what Gorgias means when he says that nothing exists is that he's looking back, or at least it seems to me as though he's looking back on these early philosophers, trying to figure out what the nature of reality is. And Gorgias proposes, maybe there's nothing out there in the external world that can be known. But then Gorgias does something interesting. He concedes, if something does exist, it certainly can't be known. Now, why does Gorgias argue this? Well, because all the philosophers are disagreeing. And if they're all disagreeing, it seems to suggest that we can't actually know what the truth is. But then he takes this one step further, and he argues, but even if it could be known, it certainly can't be communicated. Because if it could be communicated, then by now one of the philosophers would have persuaded everyone else. And so the conclusion that Gorgias draws from this is that the good life is a life where we live by appearances. We practice prudence. We're practical in our education, and we avoid idle speculation, such as the metaphysical speculations of the past. Get a job, pursue education that will make you comfortable in life, and don't simply ponder the nature of existence. And so from this argument comes a school of thought that relates to moral values. The Sophists argued that moral values are not discovered by humanity. Rather, moral values are invented by humanity. They further argue that moral rules are fashioned deliberately by each community, and have relevance and authority only for the people in that place. The Sophists also argued that moral rules are actually unnatural, and people obey them only because of the pressure of public opinion. This then leads to another proposal, and that is that the Sophists argued that the essence of justice is power, or might makes right. Because the good life, from the perspective of the Sophists, is a life of pleasure and not truth. Now you might be wondering, so what does all of this have to do with ethics and our understanding of a just society? Well, to the earliest Greek philosophers, at least those before the Sophists, and for the philosophers who come after the Sophists, such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, these big metaphysical questions, questions about the nature of reality, have everything to do with ethics. Philosopher and historian Frederick Copleston writes that when people would come to hear Plato, for example, give a lecture on goodness and morality, they were often astonished to hear nothing but arithmetic and astronomy, and of the limit and of the one. This is because Plato saw the task of learning as a task of getting our perceptions to line up with reality. Now, we can easily understand this when it comes to material objects like trees. And so, if there is a tree that exists in reality, then we might say that learning is simply a process of getting my perceptions to match with reality. This is easy enough to understand. But now, what does this mean when it comes to morality? Well, the Sophists, when Gorgias argued that nothing exists, I think what he was saying is that there is nothing outside of our perceptions that we have access to. Now, that includes the tree, but it certainly also includes moral truths. There are no moral truths out there to be discovered. All that we have are our perceptions. So now, what does this have to do with the earliest philosopher, Thales? Well, remember, Thales argued that all is water, meaning that the basic substance of reality outside of our perceptions is water. That's what we're perceiving at the deepest, most fundamental level. But of course, we are also part of this reality, meaning that our perceptions would even be reduced to water. Now, this might seem like a silly way to think about this from our perspective, but imagine thinking about this from a more modern, say, materialistic perspective. So, materialism argues that matter, or the physical universe of time, space, mass, energy, that represents the fundamental substance of all reality. This means that all phenomena, which includes our mental perceptions or all conscious activity, is ultimately reduced to material interactions. In other words, the physiological or neurological processes of the human brain are an attempt to explain other material physical processes in the cosmos. Our perceptions are ultimately reduced to neural activity. So this is, from Thales' perspective, water trying to explain water, or from a more modern materialistic perspective, matter trying to explain matter. Now, where this is interesting is when this comes to morality, because presumably, this account of morality reduces moral truths or moral judgments to neurochemical brain states. For some of the early Greek philosophers, this account of morality was not persuasive, which is why philosophers like the Pythagoreans rejected materialism and embraced the idea that everything is reduced to immaterial numbers. And so we think mathematically, we think logically, because the nature of reality itself is logical and mathematical. Now, what you need to know about Plato is that Plato was influenced by these Pythagorean philosophers, but he broadened his understanding of the nature of reality, not to be purely mathematical, but to be conceptual. Plato argued that the highest form of reality, a reality that he calls the realm of the forms, is concept. It's a conceptual reality where we have ideas like the idea of goodness. The idea of goodness is a real thing in Plato's metaphysics, which means that when you're trying to do ethics, ethics is trying to get our particular perceptions of goodness to line up with goodness itself. And so Plato is important when it comes to understanding really all of philosophy. Alfred North Whitehead famously said that the history of philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato, but it's certainly important when it comes to understanding ethics in particular. Because what Plato does is he divides reality into two parts. He argues that there is the realm of the forms, which is a realm of perfection or ideas, and there are the particulars, which are individual events, objects, or acts that we see in the world. Plato then illustrates his metaphysical perceptions on reality with his famous allegory of the cave. So in this allegory, you have prisoners who from birth are chained to a wall, and they are forced to look at shadows on the wall for their entire life. And so if you ask these prisoners, what is really real? So if you look at this picture on your screen, you see a vase on the screen, you see a circle on the screen, you see a horse, a bird. But see, these are just shadows of horses and birds and circles and vases. And so when you would ask a particular prisoner, what is a horse? What the prisoner will do is the prisoner will point at the shadow on the wall, because that's all the prisoner has ever known or seen. But the reality of a horse is actually behind the wall where the prisoners are chained. And so you can see from this story that reality is not always what directly meets the eye. And so, what are we to take away from Plato's cave illustration? Well, Plato used this story to illustrate his conception of the realm of the forms and the realm of the particulars. Reality is actually broken into 2 points. Now, the realm of the particulars are the things that we see every day. You see trees as you walk down a path. You see the computer screen that you're looking at right now. These are the shadows on the wall. But there is this other reality, and that is the reality of the forms, which is a non-material reality, but nevertheless it is real. And so Plato argues that we use our 5 senses to discover things about the material physical world in front of us, but we use our mind or our thoughts, which is a higher way of thinking for Plato. Plato, we might call him one of the first rationalists, but Plato believes in using your mind to discover things that are true about the nature of reality. And when it comes to morality, when it comes to ethics, we discover moral truths in the realm of the forms. So for Plato, the goal of ethics is about getting our particular moral acts to become more like the perfect form of goodness. And this is actually how we achieve true happiness. And so happiness is found in true goodness. Morality is about discovering moral truths, not about inventing them. No one, according to Plato, would knowingly do evil, which means that when we do evil, it's simply because we think something will make us happy, but we are mistaken. And so what Plato argues is that we should never let passion darken reason. Well, what does he mean by this, and how does this work? Well, for Plato, humanity is divided into 3 parts. All of us have our reasoning faculties, and we use reason to become aware of a goal or a value. All of us also have, according to Plato, a spirit, or we might think of it as our will. Now, the will is what drives us toward action, and it's neutral, but it can be moved. And then third, we also have our appetite, which is the desires of the body. So as we look then at the nature of humanity, and as we look at the fact that we, at least according to Plato, consist of reason, spirit, and appetite, how then should we live an ethical life? Well, Plato argues that to live an ethical life requires that we suppress our appetite, or the desires of our body, and that we use our reason to drive our will or our spirit towards actions that are rational, that are goal-orientated, that are based upon our values and principles. And the reason for this is because we might see our reason as being something that is free. We can use our reason to come up with arguments and support claims, support principles, but our appetite, the desires of our body, our emotions are things that are presumably not under our control. And so therefore, since they're not under our control, they're not reliable. And so this works at an individual level for Plato, but it also works at a social level. So we might ask, what does it mean to have a just society? Well, Plato argues that to have a just society, we need to have just rulers. And these are rulers who rule society according to reason and not according to desire. And so if we're going to have rational rulers, it means that they must have a certain type of expertise. And so now when we think of knowledge and when we think of expertise, we can think of many different examples. Medical doctors have a particular type of expertise. They need to know something about medicine, anatomy, physiology, etc. Farmers have a very different type of expertise. And so Plato asked the question, what type of expertise should a statesman or a ruler or a politician have? Well, as Plato is working through this, he argues that the expertise of a statesman breaks down into three basic categories. First, the statesman needs to know something about theoretical science. And here he breaks theoretical science into two basic types of sciences. There are the mental or idea type sciences, where you use the life of the mind to come up with theories, concepts. And then there's physical science or labor, which from Plato's perspective, this means like manual labor, working on something practical with your hands. For Plato, a statesman must be somebody who is an expert in the realm of ideas or rational philosophical type of arguments. But then he says that a statesman must also be an expert in directive sciences. And here he makes a distinction between a practitioner of truth and a spectator of truth. So a practitioner of truth is somebody who applies ideas or applies philosophical principles to everyday life, whereas a spectator is somebody who just loves to learn. And so a pure philosopher, from Plato's perspective, might be considered a spectator, somebody who loves learning about ideas but doesn't really want to do anything with them. So when Plato argues that a statesman must have expertise in directive science, he's arguing that a statesman must be able to apply moral principles to everyday life. And then third, Plato argues that a statesman must have expertise in pre-directive science. And here he makes the distinction between a producer salesman and a retailer. Well, a producer salesman is somebody that produces their own product and then sells that product to someone else, whereas a retailer is somebody who buys other people's products and then tries to sell their products. And so from Plato's perspective, a statesman must be able to produce their own product, and since the product in this situation is a mental product or a philosophical principle or an ethical principle, the the statesmen must be able to think for themselves, come up with their own ideas, and then sell those ideas to the public. And so this gives us our definition for political science, which is, from Plato's perspective, a theoretical, directive, and pre-directive science that shepherds human societies. This is the type of expertise that a statesman needs in order to run society well. Well, so this brings us now to Plato's critique of democracy. So Plato argues that theoretically, there are a few different ways that you can set up a government. You could set up a government that is ruled by one individual, and if that individual rules according to reason or according to law, some sort of ethical principle, that would be a monarch. But of course, if that one individual rules according to his or her desires or appetite, that would be tyranny. And that's a bad thing from Plato's perspective. You could also set up a government that's ruled by a few individuals, and when those individuals are ruling according to reason or law, that's called an aristocracy. But of course, if they're ruling according to their desires and appetite, then that would be called an oligarchy. And then last, you can have a society that's ruled by the masses. When the masses are ruling according to reason and law, it's a good thing, and it's called a democracy. But of course, once the masses are ruling society by their appetite or desire, it's a bad thing, and it's called anarchy. And so Plato argues that democracy is the worst form of government because, practically speaking, you are not going to be able to produce a society of people who rule according to reason or law. Now, this isn't necessarily a critique on people, more as it's a critique on a system that trains up only statesmen. If you create a society where everyone has the expertise of a statesman, Plato argues, then where would the plumbers be? Where would the medical doctors be? Where would the farmers be? In other words, to have a totally just society, you need to have a society in which different people have different types of expertise, and that will create a flourishing and just society. And so a democracy for Plato is simply not practical because we don't have enough time to train everyone in society to be an expert in political science, because people will have other interests and other career aspirations. And so if people aren't experts in political science, then how are they going to vote? Well, the only resource that they have left is to vote according to their desire, not according to knowledge, and that is anarchy, which is not an acceptable form of government for Plato. And so this was a long lecture, but this is all that I have for this week. If you have any questions, please send me an email. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.